Welcome to Straight Up with Sara. I'm so happy all of you guys continue to show up and listen to the topics that are important to me. This week, we are joined by Head of Fashion and Beauty at YouTube, Blasberg. And today's topic is Fashion Week in the time of COVID. Welcome, Derek. Thank you so much for being here.
Sara, I have to ask, are you wearing a tie-dye sweatshirt just for me as the COVID fashion expert?
Is it too much on trend or underdressed? Was it not enough?
Very much on trend. I think you can imagine the past 8 months we've seen athleisure just go through the roof. And then of course, especially on YouTube, we saw DIY fashion like tie-dye go through the roof. So if this was accidental, I still appreciate you getting dressed up for me for this call. So thank you. Great to meet you.
Derek, the reason you're here, though, is anyone that knows me knows I rarely even accidentally fall onto fashion. Without the guidance of experts like yourself, I am one of the people that is lost with no compass. So I want to start by asking something that I've always wondered. So when I think of Fashion Week, I grew up in Iowa, read the magazines, saw all the Fashion Week and celebrity pictures. What is Fashion Week? I didn't realize, why is it? What's the purpose of it? I heard there are, I've learned this since then, that there are many different fashion weeks, it's a few times a year. Can you break down the 101 of what Fashion Week is?
Yes, and I probably have a similar perspective to you about Fashion Week. I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. So the idea of the international fashion collections was new turf for me too. So the way that Fashion Week exists right now, and of course this may change in a post-COVID world, but for the past 120 years, fashion shows have existed where models display on a runway clothes for next season. In our generation, in our lifetime, Fashion Week started in New York, then went to London, Milan, and finally in Paris, 2 times a year. And designers would show clothes that they're going to preview for next season. So you would see the spring clothes in the fall, and you'd see fall clothes in the spring, because in the 6 months, it would take that long for those clothes to be made, right? But what we're seeing, what we're seeing more recently, of course, is that fashion and fashion fans have become much more immediate. They want to see things straight off the runway. We now have social media feeding us collections and gossip and news and model lives and the real stories behind our favorite fashion people immediately. So I think fashion's in a state of change.
When did they amp up? So I've seen glimpses, clips, and due to a few segments with my job, I've actually gotten to go to a few shows. When did they become so media heavy? When did the show aspect almost at times feel like it equaled or outdid the fashion?
That's a good question. And I think I would suspect that we have the supermodels. So in the early 90s, when Cindy Crawford, Naomi Campbell, Linda Evangelista, Christy Turlington, when models became larger than life and in a lot of ways, actual real life celebrities, when that happened is probably when fashion became a media event.
Okay. Now, one more random question about this. When you see all the celebrities, how do they end up at these shows? How does a regular person go to a show? Is that even possible? Because all we see are these star-studded front rows.
That's a good question. So historically, the people who went to fashion shows were press. So the people who worked at magazines and newspapers who were going to style those clothes to appear in magazines and newspapers later on, and buyers. So the people who worked at department stores who were buying clothes to put in their store. Starting in probably the noughties and the early 2000s is when we started to see a celebrity heavy front row. And that was people realizing the additional marketing effect of having Kim Kardashian or of having celebrities sit at your front row. It amplified the message and branding of your show. So, and nowadays, I would venture to say that having a celebrity in your front row was just as important as having a retailer in your front row. And that's partly because so many people now shop online. Last year, Barney's closed. Who would have thought?
I know.
But
the institution.
To answer your previous question, if I can do a shameless plug, of course, now on YouTube, anyone can go to a show because youtube.com/fashion is your front row seat to fashion weeks around the world.
You know what? That is not shameless at all, because as people from St. Louis and Iowa, there were so often times where I say I relate to more people outside of windows and studios or reading the magazines than being in the magazines. Something about that is just all I knew growing up. So this is exciting, but let's get into the right now, the year we're in. What have you or we've seen that stuck so far during this fashion week in 2020?
Well, the early part of the year. So I was in Milan in February, and I was in Paris in March. At the
Wow.
onset of the COVID crisis, we were really sort of in the thick of it. We were still trying to figure out how real, how serious is this going to be. So at the start of the year, we were sort of in the old routine, going to 6 or 7 fashion shows a day, having cocktails with the designers, going to
Oh,
dinners. And then, of course, the next season, which is right now, the shows are happening in Paris right
great.
now, is a much, much, much different outlook. But one thing I will say about the fashion community in 2020 is that in March and in April, as we saw the COVID crisis become a much more serious situation, I was I was so proud and honored to be a part of a community that did everything it could to try and
Yeah.
tend to the situation. So we had designers here in New York like Christian Siriano and
Yes.
Maxwell who started making masks. We had a lot of the like LVMH, a lot of the fragrance and Estee Lauder and the makeup companies transitioned their factories to making hand sanitizer. And as we even got further into this sort of surreal year, and social justice issues became so apparent in the world at large, but also in the
Yeah.
fashion community. We had designers like Aurora James, who's an accessories designer, and she developed this thing called the 15% pledge, where she would appeal to retailers to promise to make sure that 15% of the products on their shelves were by Black-owned businesses, which is incredible. And
Yeah.
Sephora was the first company to sign up, and since then we've seen West Elm sign up. Vogue agreed to feature 15% of Black-owned fashion businesses in their editorial scheduling. So the fashion community, which I think is often sometimes thought of as superfluous or only creative-minded, really shifted gears in 2020. And I'm super impressed and proud of the steps that we've made. And I hope in 2021 and 2022 and forever, the things that we saw bubble to the surface this year continue to inform what we're doing in the future.
Absolutely. And one question I have though is, so these are a lot of these businesses you're mentioning, and when we talk of Fashion Week, we talk a lot about established businesses that are already there. How are emerging new designers kind of handling all of this? Because this is like the Super Bowl twice a year. I now know that that they depend on. So how are they finding their foothold in this?
What's been sort of, I guess, inspiring to see in the current situation is that for a long time, budget informed impact. So it would be these huge designers that were able to throw these multi-million-dollar extravaganza shows. But when you start looking at Fashion Week from a digital perspective, budget doesn't always inform impact. Sometimes it's about having a good idea. Sometimes about having a novel approach to Fashion Week. There was an American brand that showed as part of the Milan fashion calendar, and they did a stop motion fashion show. So they had
Oh,
little characters. They even made like a little stop motion Anna Winter in the front row watching the show, and and there's another company that's based that also showed on the Milan fashion calendar. It's called GCDS, and they did this sort of sci-fi avatar collection. They used real models, a diverse cast of real models that they then, sort of, I should know more about this. I work at a tech company, but sort of like a VR, AR scan of their bodies, and they brought them out, and that show was also super incredible. And those are two brands that I probably would not have had on the top of my list in the old form. We'd be going to the more big and established and well-known labels. And
right.
also to their credit, we've also seen a lot of novel thinking from that size brands too. In July, when Dior did their couture show, they did a fantasy fairy tale featuring forest nymphs wearing miniature versions of the couture dresses. And last week, Moschino did a puppet show, so they redesigned all of their their entire collection using marionettes on
Oh,
the.
wow.
So this is a very tricky time, I think, in all industries, and fashion, of course, is reckoning with a lot of events on a global scale. But it has been encouraging to see the creativity that really fuels
Yeah.
the industry come alive and find a foothold.
Well, it sounds like that boom in showmanship that kind of came, as you said, at the beginning of the 2000s kind of has served them because it set them up to do so many of these more non-traditional shows. But what do you think people are talking about at the fashion, like in the fashion world? Like, are they nervous about where we go in the future? Are these the new norms? Are they excited?
To be perfectly candid with you, I think everyone in this fashion swirl has for a long time looked at the industry and wondered how it should be updated. And so the COVID crisis, the social justice initiatives, all the things that have happened in 2020 have accelerated those conversations. So do we have too many fashion weeks? Is it sustainable or logical to travel around the world multiple times a year to see a 13-minute show?
Right.
And and I think a lot of those questions are going to have different answers in 2021 than they did in 2019. During New York Fashion Week earlier in September, a lot of the New York designers that we've come to know and love, Marc Jacobs, Tory Burch, Michael Kors, they sat out of the traditional fashion schedule. They're going to show in October, which is about a month later. And I think the idea there is to produce less clothes, have a shorter window between when they are shown and in stores, so consumers don't feel like the clothes that they're buying should be on sale sooner. So I don't want to bore you with the granularity of the retail schedule, but I definitely think the way that clothes are designed, produced, and sold will be much different going forward.
But in a way, I feel like that's emblematic of the world as a whole, because so many times it takes a reset button, not that we wish it in the form of a pandemic, but with everything that this is shaken up, it's forced everyone to look at their business models and say, is this working? Why did we do it that way? Does it make sense to do it going forward? So it makes sense that this would be happening to fashion as well. But you are, friends with a bunch of the designers, and I saw on your Instagram that you ran into Zach Posen in Central Park, where he was pinning plastic bags to mannequins that said, "Thank you for your business." Tell me about this.
I mean, trash. It was basically making couture dresses out of trash bags. And, New York Fashion Week was very surreal this season. It was a lot smaller. It was only a couple days. It really wasn't New York Fashion Week. It was more like New York Fashion Weekend. That's because I think a lot of designers here in New York didn't have access to their ateliers. And Zach actually, his business his investors pulled the plug on his traditional dressmaking business earlier this year. So in a lot of ways, I think he was just going back to basics. I live near Central Park. This was not like a choreographed fashion show meetup. I was walking my dog, and then I saw Zach Posen, who I've known for years, creating dresses out of trash bags in the middle of Central Park. And I sort of loved that as a New York moment. So many shows in New York
Yeah.
so many shows were virtual only in New York. It was great. And a surreal twist, that was the only show I actually physically went to this season was Zach's show in Central Park. Uh,
His impromptu show in Central Park.
which
Now,
no one would have thought that, earlier in 2020, our plans for September we often say is the January of fashion, because September is like the biggest season, the back to school, everyone's shopping
right.
for the rest of the year. So it's been a surreal season for sure.
Before I let you go, Derek, I have to ask you, St. Louis, Missouri to, fashion guy rubbing elbows at all these shows. How did you get here?
That's a good question. So in St. Louis, Missouri, I imagine you have a very similar
Sure.
experience. I didn't know what a stylist was. I didn't know
Nope.
what an art director was. And we're pre-digital. I mean, I hate to say it.
Yeah.
So there wasn't a Google feature for me to say, what is a stylist? But when I moved to New York for college to study journalism at NYU, I very quickly encountered this whole world of photography and art and magazines and fashion. And I was like, oh, this is what I'm meant to do. And so
This is amazing. Yeah.
But I interned all through college. I got my first job at Vogue when I graduated, which I was fired from, which is a whole other conversation for a whole other
Part
show.
two.
Sarah, watch this space. And so, you sort of hustle and you work in fashion. But one thing that I will say, and I think this is something we can probably both attest to, is that what's awesome about the social media world now is that when I was 16 and 17 and 18 and so desperate for fashion and fashion news, there's probably 16 and 17-year-olds in Missouri and Ohio, and they can at least go on to YouTube, but also Instagram or Google or these other platforms and dive into the fashion world. And I think that's incredible. So I love what I do. And I never thought when I was growing up, I would be working at a tech company, live streaming fashion shows, but that's what we do here. And it feels great.
It's the miracle of life, Derek. You kind of have to keep your head up and watch where it takes you.
Exactly.
But thank you so much for being here today. And I want to remind everyone that this guy right here is our VIP ticket. So for all of those who are watching, you can go to youtube.com/fashion to check out all the shows. As he's already teased here, you don't want to miss it. Derek, you're great. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. It's great to see you. I hope I see you soon.
I hope I'm wearing even cuter clothes.
If you have any questions, I'm your guy.
Oh my gosh, you're going to regret that.
I'm friend right now. This is the best outfit. Athleisure and tie-dye. You won. You've done it.
Wait, it's accidental, but I'm going to own it. Thank you so much, Derek.
Great to see you. Have a good one.
You too. Bye.